friends, welcome to another episode of the 10 Laws podcast with East Forest. I'm East Forest. This is coming out one day late because the election was yesterday, depending on when you're listening to this, and I'm filming this the day after, and I kind of wanted to see how that went, and I don't know. In some ways, it went a little bit as I expected, but not as I hoped, in that we currently, on this day, November 4th, do not have definitive answers on the presidential race or some other parts of the race. And I know that's stressful, probably for everybody in different ways. But we did get some good news in Oregon, my home state, where I grew up. They passed Measure 110 and 109, which is to decriminalize small possession of various hard drugs. But what I'm really excited about is 109, which is to legalize the psilocybin for therapeutic use. So it's now the first state in the country to do that. And this is a sign of hope for me, and I hope for all people, and that we're seeing that there's the ability to use these as tools, and our own communities and governments slowly starting to support structures to be able to provide that kind of therapy. So I wanted to have Sara Gael on this featured this week. We spoke a bit back, and she's from MAPS, and we talk about these sorts of subjects among others, and I think you'll find it very interesting, and I'm really glad she could come on the show. But I just want to encourage you guys to keep in touch with that part of yourselves, that candle flame within that is not blown by any storm. And whatever is happening externally, you can always get in touch with that part of yourself, that quiescence that is you too. If you want to try using the meditation for chaotic times, that's now on Spotify and Apple, wherever you listen to music, you can use that as a method of tapping into sort of being an eye in the storm. But, look, we're always we don't want to feel like we're going from crisis to crisis as an individual. And I'm going to say that you're not. Even as the chaos ensues around us, in some ways it always does, in different shapes and forms and in different waves of timing for each of us, and how those coincide with the greater world and our internal process is unique to each of us, but that's part of incarnation. And you can have that discernment and engagement with the world and still be in touch with that solidity inside you that I'm contending is always there. And I think you know that. So the Spores record is out now, and I'm going to feature a song from that at the end. And I want to thank all you who showed up for the spatial remix event with Envelop. Thanks to Envelop and Christopher Willits and his team for putting that together for us. That was super fun. I hope to get that mix from him, and maybe I'd be able to share it with you in some other way in a little bit more higher fidelity than they could do on the stream. But I don't know. Stay tuned. And just other housekeeping note is that we're putting out some new merch items in this ensuing days and weeks. One of them is a Ram Dass print of like the front cover artwork, the painting that Elizabeth Hilton did. And so you can get it in full size, like the painting itself, and a 12 by 12 vinyl. So that'll be up at eastforest.org. And we're working on a couple other things, working on a new shirt or sweatshirt. If we can get that done soon, we're trying. And might be able to get the smoke blend, or herbal smoke blend, is going to be back on the eastforest.org merch site soon as well. But you can always get the perfume oils, and there's still some Spores vinyls and Held vinyls and Old Church vinyls. Held's almost gone. Spores is moving pretty quickly. The Old Church is on sale, that vinyl, and great holiday gifts. So get on that if you want to get some advanced shopping done for the holidays, or just say that you really love someone, or you love yourself and you want to support East Forest. That's always a wonderful way to do that. Thank you for subscribing to the podcast and leaving a review. If you're on a place that you can leave a review, like Apple Podcasts, it makes a big difference. Hit subscribe, show your support, share the podcast with your friends on social media, and say hello anytime at info@eastforest.org. We appreciate it. Thanks for being a part of the community. All right, let's get into this wonderful conversation with Sara Gael. But thank you so much for taking the time to join us in this early snowy weather out there in Boulder. I heard your name bandied about here and there, psychedelic events and so forth. And it's a relatively small community that we're in. And so I'm really just glad we could get a chance to connect in person, so to speak, in the virtual space. And I want to start by, if you could just give us a very brief introduction. You wear a few different hats, and I know you're connected or are connected with the Zendo Project. And I'd like to use that as a launching pad to ask a couple questions. So could you just give us just a little background on who you are and what you're up to?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. So I have been working at MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, since around 2013. And the Zendo Project is the harm reduction department's main program at MAPS. And so it is part of MAPS.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I was confusing with like Dance Safe, or is that all the same thing? Different.
So different. Dance Safe is a different organization. I also serve on the board of directors at Dance Safe.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So Zendo Project has to do with harm reduction in general, right?
Zendo Project focuses specifically on peer support harm reduction. So what the Zendo Project focuses on is providing safe spaces and specialized care for people who are having challenging psychedelic experiences. And we work mostly in festival settings, but we also provide education and outreach.
Okay. So in the pandemic, things have shifted so much in all ways. And in the psychedelic space, some people are still wanting to explore the inner landscape, but trying to figure out ways to do it that feels safe for them. And there's still so many people now who are entering into this space totally virgin and new to the experience. And they want to know how to do it safely or just, steps that they can take. And I often talk a lot about ceremony and intention and the container in essence. And music is a big deal for me as a mechanism of guiding someone, sort of like a digital guide in a way. But I've also heard people talk about like, hey, this is not such a great time to be diving into that space, maybe because you don't have the support you think you need or that you might normally have, or hey, things are really heightened and crazy, and maybe it could just amplify that for you. I mean, what are your takes on using these psychedelic tools now to help us through this? You think that's more harmful, or do you think it's more beneficial?
Yeah, so we are in such an especially incredibly challenging time right now. And a lot of people, like you said, are going through a lot emotionally, psychologically. My background is in transpersonal counseling psychology, and that field of psychology really looks at humans embedded within the larger system and framework of society and of the universe. And one of the main principles and tenets of transpersonal psychology is that we are impacted and really affected by everything that is going on around us in the world, even if we're not present for something physically. And especially right now with everything that's happening in the world, with COVID, with protests, everything that is going on, I really think that we're seeing the head of things that have been happening for such a long time. So everything's really coming to a head.
Yeah.
And it is already in its own way, I think, it's similar to a challenging psychedelic experience that we're all going through right now collectively together. And so I think that there's not really, I don't think that there's a one answer to if right now is a worse or better time for people to be exploring psychedelics. The reality is people are exploring, just like they have for millennia. And right now, like you mentioned, because psychedelics are becoming much more, you could say mainstream, they're becoming I believe that psychedelic use is definitely increasing, and the vast majority of psychedelic use happens outside of clinical contexts, therapeutic contexts, and ceremonial contexts, right? So, and I think that this is a question that we're really talking about right now in psychedelic spaces, and there's a lot of dialogue around how to, safe harm reduction practices for people who are choosing to use psychedelics during this time. And I just think it's, harm reduction is all about, it's a big field. Harm reduction is a really big field, much bigger than psychedelics, and really focuses on a alternative to prohibitionist models of dealing with substance use. And specifically with psychedelic use, it's really about having honest conversations and dialogues around psychedelics, and also helping to mitigate the risks that are associated with psychedelics. So pandemic or not, there are inherent risks associated with psychedelics. And it's really important as a society and as a psychedelic movement for us to adequately address the risks associated with psychedelics, especially if we're going to be really speaking about the benefits, to which there are, many potential benefits for psychedelics. And so it's important to have a really balanced perspective, right? And in the 60s, that's a lot of what we didn't have. And we didn't have those tools for the same awareness around the risks and how to work with those risks. So at the Zendo Project, we really deal with the emotional, challenging experiences that people have when they take psychedelics. And it's normal for psychedelics to bring up challenging things. That's why they work in therapy. That's why they're so beneficial in therapeutic settings or in ceremonial settings. One of the reasons is because they bring up things to work with, right? So right now, I think some things for people to be aware of from a harm reduction perspective is just set and setting. So being aware that your mindset might be really different right now than your normal baseline. So really paying attention to, if you're experiencing depression, anxiety, if you're feeling very not in a good place and not grounded and not feeling well, I think it's really tempting for people to say, oh, well, I'll just use psychedelics, right? And they're kind of seen as, sometimes seen as this thing that's just going to fix everything. And it's important for people to recognize, I think, that if you're having a challenging experience and you take psychedelics to try to help yourself, that if you are not paying attention to set and setting, that it could go, it could actually make things worse. So it could exacerbate things. So it's important to just keep in mind that, they're not a panacea, that it is really important. And if you choose to take them, I really recommend not taking, it's funny right now because everyone's so alone, but, not taking any psychedelic that you haven't taken, especially for the first time alone. If you're taking a certain substance for the first time, so if you've taken LSD, but you haven't taken psilocybin, I really recommend that you don't take a substance for the first time by yourself, especially in a higher dose. A lot of people go to higher doses. So you want to start off at a lower dose rather than going for that high, heroic dose of something. And ideally, you are with somebody who is experienced, who knows the terrain, who is not going to freak out, who's going to be able to be a grounded presence for you. So that's one thing, a couple things to consider is just, we're in really heightened times right now. And it's not just going to, taking a psychedelic without paying attention to the safety of your container, of your setting is not always the best idea.
Yeah, they reveal things, and at the end of the day, you're the one making changes. I think of psychedelics as tools that are particularly adept at times of transition, whether personal transition or they're ways to help lubricate the wheels of change, I find. Like, in a sense, they are helping move forward an evolution that is wanting to happen. And often in times of depression or in times of dis-ease, there's something that feels a bit stuck, or we're needing to accept, in essence, what is growing, emerging, or what wants to die so something new can be born. And these are all natural, like, human processes. And so it seems quite obvious that what's happening collectively right now is a very big form of that. So many things, as you spoke to correctly, are being revealed and wanting to be shifted and so forth. And so we need to allow that to happen. But it's very complex and it's very big, and it's on the micro and the macro. So in some ways, you could say, well, psychedelics could be a especially useful tool right now to kind of help usher that process, albeit also with these inherent challenges that you're talking to. So it's sort of like a little bit of a catch-22, like this whole process we're in, where it is kind of the perfect tool, but it's also, there are some unique challenges in using them. But I can't help notice that it's kind of ripe. If I think, I mean, I have my own reservations about it, but nonetheless, I can see how it could be quite useful, and it's sort of like a medicine for the times more than I've ever seen, in a way, because we need fast change in some ways. Not that fast is better, but at the same time, we're facing some really serious challenges. And I don't think it's the kind of thing where you can drop this and everyone has the experience and everything changes. I don't believe that at all. But for those who feel drawn to it, I agree it's going to happen in different ways. So it's like, how can we give people the tools to have the most positive, safe experience possible? Because they're going to make their own decisions. And so it's sort of providing that information,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And there's a lot of resources out there that currently exist. I'll provide some resources for your listeners. We have some on our website. We have a lot of resources on tools for guiding, peer support, basic drug education, and harm reduction techniques. And some of the information that we have and the resources that we have are very practical, and some of them are more philosophical or theoretical. But we have a pretty extensive list of resources, and I'll point you to some others as well. And one of those resources that we recommend is a website of integration therapists, psychedelic integration therapists. And it's the website is psychedelic.support. And I think that right now, especially in the past, the decade, there's been a huge shift in mental health, and people are starting to really mental health services and therapy is much less stigmatized, similar to psychedelics, right? There's less stigma. And there's a lot of therapists out there who work on this field called psychedelic integration. And if you're considering taking a psychedelic, it can be really helpful to talk to a therapist who is friendly to psychedelics, right? Who is an ally. And so this particular website has a lot of therapists who integration work is really focusing on helping people integrate after an experience. But many therapists also will talk to people if they want to have an experience and just help them. They don't provide guidance or support during the experience, but they just provide some information that might help them prepare if they're choosing to have an experience. So I really recommend that people utilize the work that's out there, because there are so many therapists who are doing this work to support people around psychedelic experiences.
If you're not integrating the more you do that, the more meat you get off the bone, because the more it actually becomes something that integrates into your waking and walking life, for sure. It's funny you say that, because anytime I've seen a therapist in my life, I always ask them in my little, getting to know them, have they done psychedelics, and sort of what kind and how deep have they gone? Because I remember a quote from Steve Jobs. I just read this in the Times in his obituary, that he said about his wife that she had never done LSD, and he felt like on a certain level there were things they could never get to know about each other because they didn't share that sort of landscape of experience. And it's kind of a dickish Steve Jobsy things, but I also kind of understand what he's trying to say. And I would feel that with a therapist, in some ways, the experiences that have been had in those spaces they're ineffable and unexplainable in many ways, yet also deeply inform what it means to be in this world, this more dimensional, three-dimensional world we're in, and trying to make sense of it. Like I have to use those metaphors and those experiences to understand this too. And without that lexicon to share on any level, I don't. It's just sort of like I feel like we're cutting ourselves off from the knees and trying to like run a marathon. It's like I thought we're here to like really figure out what's going on in the internal psyche and landscape. And so I think it's great that those people are out there. And I know many people are looking for, they want people to help guide them through it more than anything. They're trying to find just the help because they want to feel safe, right? And I know we're in this tricky spot. How are things in Denver where you're near there with this sort of decriminalization and people in this landscape? Because I know there was also recently, I think it was in Denver, a bust, like a federal bust on some guy who was being a little boastful about growing and selling mushrooms. And I don't know if they're trying to send a message federally, but I'm not sure what the landscape is right now of what people are doing there and not doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, to the first thing that you mentioned there, yeah, I think that can be absolutely really helpful for, a therapist to have had their own experiences. There's a lot of ways in which people can access altered states. Some therapists really, psychedelics aren't their thing, and meditation or yoga or there's so many other ways to access those
right.
states. So I've been a therapist, an investigator in the MAPS MDMA PTSD trials since about 2013. And as part of that work, when you're working as an investigator in that research study, you have the opportunity to actually take MDMA in a guided session with two of the trainer therapists, and it's part of the training. And so, the therapists are given that opportunity so that when they sit with the clients on MDMA, that they have had the experience, so they're able to actually, hold that space. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And to your second point, I live in Boulder, and I serve on the board of, so we have a Denver psilocybin policy review panel. And so that panel actually reports to the mayor, and it is a committee, and it's made up of people from the city as well as harm reduction. I serve as the harm reduction advocate. We have a therapist on that committee, and then we have people from local sheriff's department, and we have people from the city, and so we are working to create and to help inform some of the policies that are going to be in place around psilocybin. So right now, a lot of things are really being, part of the intention of this panel is to inform those policies moving forward. So right now, we're kind of in this really gray area situation where we're developing those policies actively at the panel. And
how's it going?
It's going really well. Yeah. The panel is actually the first kind of this panel that has ever existed, and it's really wonderful to be working in collaboration side by side with with city officials, and having a team that is so interdisciplinary of people who have, more of a psychedelic background, have been working in the psychedelic field, along with people who are working more on the policy regulation side of things. And so it really is a truly interdisciplinary panel. And our report is due early next year in the spring, and that report is going to have recommendations to the city for how to manage and navigate the policies. But one thing that we're working on that I'm really excited about is we're actually bringing some of the training, harm reduction training on how to support people during psychedelic experiences. We're bringing that to the city of Denver, different responders. So Denver City paramedics, law enforcement, sheriff's department, fire, and they have a co-responders unit, a team of mental health professionals, social workers who go out on calls with law enforcement when the issue is more of a behavioral or mental health issue.
Sure.
So we're working to help train all of those various departments on specifically on psilocybin and the effects of psilocybin, and how they can best navigate and deal with the incidents of people who are using psilocybin. And they're really, the city has been really receptive to this curriculum. And after cannabis was, cannabis in Colorado, after that was decriminalized, it was, they did see some issues, with people who were using cannabis and coming to the city specifically for that, because cannabis is a hell of a drug.
Especially when you eat it. Yeah.
Yeah. It can be incredibly have, psychedelic
you ever heard
effects.
You ever heard the 911 call of the police officer who calls 911 because he ate too many pot brownies?
I did hear that.
He thinks his wife is dead on the floor, and he thinks he's dead, but he's on the phone. And they confiscated it apparently, and then he took it, and they made brownies, and then they ate too many, and it went so far. I can picture it. His wife's face down on the floor, just like completely in a hole, and he's like, "I need to call 911," and he starts explaining what happened. And
perfect harm reduction opportunity right there. That illustrates the importance of harm reduction.
Yes. And so, are there people in Denver who are openly like guiding journeys, or doing kind of like therapists who are sort of not just doing the integration? Can they legally help people walk through a journey in any way?
So there isn't currently a framework in Denver for that. That's a really, it's a different, if you look at Oakland, they're doing some work there. Oakland is an example of a city that when they passed their initiative, they had much more, every city's initiative is different. So right now there's, decrim in Oakland, in Oregon, in DC. And so as each of these cities and states decriminalize certain substances, then they're all doing it kind of slightly different. It's similar to when cannabis went through the system, right? So everyone has a slightly different approach, and the approach in Oakland is definitely more to integrate it and to have guides. And I hope that we can work towards that in Denver in the future, whether that's having safe spaces for people or looking at regulations for guiding and things like that. So that's not currently the focus of our panel, but I think that in the future, once we get the report next year, I think that there'll be opportunities to discuss how things can be integrated more in the future.
What's standing in the way of that right now? Is it just sort of policy making its way through the public system, or is it a legality? 'Cause I know in Oakland, like if they're doing that, they are in a gray area. Like they might have decriminalized it in the city, but it's still illegal federally. So do you have any anecdotal stories of how that's going? Or is it just sort of happening and they're trying to keep it like low profile?
Well, it was built into the initiative. So when the initiative passed, part of that included a section on wanting it to be used for more like therapeutic purposes. So that was, since it's built in, if something's built into the initiative like that, then immediately when they're working with the city or with the state, then they're talking about, okay, how can we roll this out in a way that is in alignment with the bill that was passed, right? So in Denver, that wasn't included in the initiative.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, and so here, I think that, and yes, you're right, it's still a gray area because of the federal issue. And so a lot of states are just really figuring out, how to navigate that right now. Because, especially if you're a licensed therapist, right? Say if you're a licensed therapist and you're wanting to work with a psychedelic, even if it's decriminalized, there's your license, right? So if you're federally, you hold a license and that has federal guidelines to it. So, there's the licensure process of the therapist, and then there's getting money, right? So if you get paid, that's a transaction. And so right now, psilocybin is decriminalized, but you're not supposed to be selling it, right? That's supposed to be, it's decriminalized for personal use.
It's not taxed. I mean, it has similarities to cannabis that's also legal federally, but a lot of people aren't in the banking system. That's a whole complicated thing. They work in cash, but there's lots of tax. So they're working within that system. I'm wondering, because I know, do you have mainstream concerns about psilocybin in particular and how it can move into more of a mainstream? If you look at cannabis as an example, and I know there's companies like Compass Pathways and so forth, like how it might go where we have the psilocybin, it's going to be sold and taxed, and inside now that system where they're trying to like regulate it and make money. What are some of your concerns of how we navigate that process?
Yeah. Right now there's so much conversation happening around, the mainstreaming of psychedelics and commercialization. And I think that there's sort of an inevitability of commercialization of psychedelics. And, it's sort of this catch-22, because I think that it is helpful that psychedelics are becoming more mainstream. People are having experiences, the stigma is going down. I think that that's really important. But simultaneously, when something becomes popular, when it becomes mainstream, then there's all these concerns, right? So with capitalism and all this, it's like the capitalistic framework has its flaws, and so we're major flaws, right? So we're moving into that space, and it's like, how can you move into a space like that while still holding integrity and ethics? And that's a lot of what MAPS is really focused on right now, and there's other organizations who are also really focused on this. There's a project called North Star that is really focused on, Liana at MAPS is one of the founders of that project. And they're really looking at exactly the question you're asking. So how do we bring in psychedelics into the mainstream and do it in an ethical way? And so there's a lot of guidelines, and obviously, there's different people and different organizations having this conversation. But North Star, I think, is a really good example of an organization that's really putting out a lot of content on ethics and what it looks like to bring psychedelics into the mainstream, into society in an ethical way. And so that's really, some major points are, it's really, I think it's really important to honor that there's been a lot of people doing this work for a really long time. And, there's a lot of people who are coming into the field, and, they see the opportunity. And I think that, whether that's investors or new companies, and I think some of the risk is really not honoring the roots. If we don't honor the roots of where something came from, if we don't, and it's not just about, it's those roots run much deeper than the West, right? So I think that even psychedelic use in the West is sort of cut off often from the roots of psychedelic use, right? So there's centuries and centuries of indigenous practice of certain medicines, and yes, we have these new substances that are synthetic, and but I think it's really important to honor that the psychedelic experience is something that people have been having, for thousands of years. So when that comes to this new, commercialization and mainstreaming of psychedelics, I think one of the major risks is losing that connection to the history of psychedelics, to sort of the major people who have been working in the field, making sure that those people who were the pioneers, who've been working at this for decades, right? That they are part of the conversation because they have the knowledge and they have the experience. So I think one of the dangers is people who are newer to this field coming in without having that sort of, memory, that collective memory of the movement. And what comes as part of that memory is how to use psychedelics in safe ways, how to be ethical around the use of these medicines, awareness of some of the issues that can come up in the psychedelic field, both on the personal level as well as on the community level. There's a lot of ethical and issues to navigate with psychedelics because there's such powerful tools, and especially around the use of psychedelics in therapy and the use of psychedelics as a guide. It's really, ethical issues are really front and center. We have to be really, really mindful because there's such a power dynamic already in a therapist-client relationship. And so that needs to be attended to. And then, I just think that accessibility is another huge ethical issue. How can we make these medicines available for everyone? And that's a huge issue in mental health care right now in general. And that's one that I think the psychedelic field is already facing and is going to need to face, is how do we make these substances available for those, especially for those who need it the most? And that's one of the biggest issues of capitalism, right? The people who are left behind and who aren't able to benefit from advances in things like mental health. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that I believe the leading edge of the psychedelic wave, beyond the legality issue, which I think gets a lot of the attention, is how do we make the medicines relevant to the people who you don't see, and that's mostly BIPOC people. When you go to the conferences or you go to any kind of underground event, it's largely people who are generally white and have money, and a lot of men too, and so I think we can pick apart some of the obvious reasons why that is. I think it's more about opportunity and cultural relevancy of a lot of times when you get into spiritual things like this, it comes often from an affluence. Like, you have the time, you have the ability to explore this stuff, on the most basic level. But I think it's a really difficult and important question to start working on. And I know there's a lot of wonderful people working on this now, and it's also partially a byproduct of the Black Lives Matter movement, is how the psychedelic medicine fits into that model as part of all of this. Because we talked originally about how they're great for tools of transition and change. Well, now there's a big one. And healing and working with trauma. And it's like, and these things are really, really sticky and tricky, but these are really, really, really powerful medicines. So what have you been finding are ways that we can make it relevant to people who don't have access, haven't had access, people of color who not only maybe are they less represented in that world, but there's also some skepticism. Culturally, it's been there too, because of things that have happened from our own governments with psychedelics, actually, and vaccines and all. These are real things that happened in the past. How do we overcome that? How do we make it more relevant? How do we make this work for everybody? I know this is like a question that I don't expect there to be an easy answer to, but it's just something to explore. What have you been thinking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the most, or one of the most important things that I've been thinking about, and that is one of the major focuses at MAPS, is asking that exact question to BIPOC communities, right? So bringing people, inviting everyone to the table for that conversation, right? So that it's not just, so that we don't adapt the white savior complex, and that people aren't coming in trying to figure out what is good for these communities, but that the communities are being asked themselves, right? Mm-hmm. So part of that really involves centering and uplifting the voices of BIPOC in the psychedelic community, of which there are many. And so part of what we've been really doing with MAPS and with the Zendo Project is bringing in people who work in the field of, specifically with Zendo Project, people who work in the field of harm reduction, and who have created different organizations that are doing harm reduction work, and helping to bring awareness to those organizations that exist, helping to funnel and generate funds, maybe through fiscal sponsorship, right? So more like bigger organizations that can generate funds as well as the marketing for these different organizations. So we also have a lot of, we've been having, more conversations on webinars. So bringing in people, who are talking about BIPOC issues in psychedelic spaces and bringing them in on our webinars, on our talks, on our panels, so more representation at conferences, more representation. I know we're not doing like live conferences right now, but in a lot of focus really right now on bringing in those voices to answer, that exact question, as well as to really just uplift and center those organizations and those people. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, some of it's an economic issue. Let's just talk about accessibility, because I think if you look at the medicalization model, one concern is that it could be really expensive. And our medical model in general is crazy expensive. So it's like, well, how do we make this available to people who don't have any money or not a lot of money? Or are you more in sort of the decriminalization, sort of like, look, let people make their own decisions, and it's sort of the freedom of that? Or I know MAPS is a little bit more in the medical model typically of let's regulate, let's go through the system, make it work, and do it in a particular way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm a fan of whatever gets us there and multiple directions. And when I say whatever gets us there, I don't mean whatever, but I mean the intelligent ways to get us there. Obviously that
I thought you meant guns and
yeah. So, ends definitely don't justify means. So, I think that, so I'm working in harm. I kind of have work that I'm doing in harm reduction, in the medicalization, and in decriminalization, right? So I'm working in all three of those realms. And I think that it's important that the people in those different sectors, that they work together, and that we work, collaboratively, knowing that we're all trying to achieve the same goal. And I think that decriminalization is going to be able to do certain things quicker and different. It's going to be different, and medicalization and harm reduction kind of just holds it all. Harm reduction is kind of this, like, in general, how do we help create more safety in the psychedelic experience, whether it's therapy or people using in their own home. So I think that this question of accessibility, I think that we're going to see that different organizations and different people are going to have unique approaches. So there's likely going to be, more expensive retreat centers in the future, where people who choose to go and do that will do that. And then there will be, and there already are, organizations that are popping up that are focused on, the nonprofit model or possibly the public benefit model, and with a focus on creating things like scholarships and having money that is specifically put aside, that donors they can fundraise for, that donors are specifically focused on providing money for that specific cause, right, to help address the accessibility issue. And so I think that one of the big things in the future will be insurance, right? Like, how do we work with insurance? And that's one thing that the medicalization
in general, that's a big problem. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because we're simultaneously talking about, like, right now, the mental health system, just like the medical system in the U.S., is just so messed up. We're so broken. And so it's like psychedelics are both coming into this system and it's like, okay, how do we play with this system? How do we play well with the existing systems that exist? Well, also being like, we need to reform these systems. And I think psychedelics are reforming these. I mean, that's what psychedelics are doing, is there is the opportunity here for major system reform. But when you come in and you want to reform a system, you're going to run up against so many different obstacles.
Yeah. It could be argued that, we're trying to fit into a system that's like a sinking ship. It's like, it's such this lumbering FDA. The whole thing is just like, impossible. I mean, what's a psychedelic precondition? We get into these sorts of crazy ideas. And I mean, I don't know. I totally hear you, and I'm not advocating one or the other because I honestly don't know. But this idea, it was smart of like decriminalizing on a municipal level, because it's like, yeah, that seems like you could get that done, as opposed to like, okay, let's work at the federal level with 380 million people. I mean, good luck. I mean, God. I mean, just look at the cannabis movement, how that just kind of organically kept going and going and going. And we're still at this place of like, it's pretty much publicly accepted. There's been no real issues. It's making a lot of money for a lot of people in states, and it's still illegal federally. It's like, it doesn't even make sense. Still putting people in jail for that. And there's still people in jail for that. And so you look at things like that are Schedule 1 with psilocybin and other psychedelics. And yeah, I look at the ketamine model a little bit, where that's really burgeoning. And I've had a little bit of experience in that lately because my partner has been working for a clinic here in Boise, Idaho, and leading like group sessions. And so I'm sort of now just paying attention to that ecosystem more. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of this ethical backbone of, it really feels like a gold rush. I feel like I introduced the North Star Pledge actually to this place. It says, I think this would be a great thing, not just because it's effective, because it's, or like if it's a badge you can wear to say like, hey, this is our North Star for people out there looking for where to get their ketamine therapy. Because there are some places where you pretty much just can pay, you go in and there's no therapy. They're just shooting you with the medicine, and it can be incredibly powerful. I mean, talk about harm reduction. There really isn't any. It's just sort of like, oh, it won't kill you, and it hopefully will make you less depressed, so here you go. And it's like, hold up here. This is just a small slice of the pie. A large piece of it is that processing, that integration, the preparation, the sort of, how do I walk through these spaces that baffle the conscious mind? So as the ketamine, the way that's coming into the fore, because it was already scheduled differently, so it didn't have to switch, and it sort of came through the back door in a sense, and now it's really like there's a lot of money coming up in that, these $1,200 sessions in LA and stuff, and even ads on Instagram and virtual sessions. And I'm not saying bad or good, but you're seeing it happen, the American model of like, okay, let's go for it. What are you seeing in that as sort of an analogy that we might see or not see with things like psilocybin?
Yeah. Ketamine is definitely an interesting case. It's such an intense experience in the higher doses. It's really important to be working with skilled people. And I think with this, it's like education is key because, people are going to be, the growth can sometimes happen quicker than regulation, right? So people are going to be doing all kinds of things. And when we saw, when I saw ketamine, gosh, I guess a decade ago, kind of saw like a future trajectory. And then I started offering ketamine therapy at a clinic here in Boulder a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago. And when we started doing ketamine-assisted therapy, we were looking around the space, and this was before the big sort of boom happened.
Yeah.
And that we were concerned, right? Because we saw this, and it was just like, oh, we really need to integrate more therapy. And there were people who were doing ketamine therapy, absolutely. And now, so I did that for a couple of years, and now we see a lot more ketamine therapists. And so that is one move in the right direction is ketamine therapy, right? Like working with therapists who actually have experience doing, psychedelic therapy. And in a lot of cities right now, you can find people whereas even 5 years ago, it was much more just the clinic model. So I think the more that we educate people that there's two main things that exist. There's like infusions and then there's therapy. And if people are going for mental health purposes, for emotional and psychological health purposes, that they really consider educating themselves and becoming, going to a therapy center instead of a just an infusion center. And so that's one thing. And, and then amongst ketamine therapy, being really aware, learning about the therapists. So how long have they been practicing? What are their background? What's their education background? What's their experience in the psychedelic field? Right. Because I think that there's a lot of learning going on right now. And I think it's really important that, therapists don't just I think it as for an ethical integrity note for therapists, before you start doing ketamine therapy, really get the training, right? There are ketamine therapy training programs out there that are good. And so research those programs, learn about the people who have been working with ketamine for years, for decades, because those people do exist. And so seek out training from those people. And I think that to your question, that really is the same for as other psychedelics start to become more available. Those rules can be applied to that as well.
Yeah, I'm torn because here I am saying these things, and then I hear you say what I'm saying back about there's not much regulation. Then part of me is like, regulation. But then I'm like, wait a minute, but maybe that's the problem. And it's it's so tough because I in my heart, I feel but what I want is the freedom for people to decide and do what they need to do, and they make the decisions. So you saying it's sort of about re-education and education and tools, because there are always going to be, I would hope, many options. And you just want people to have the freedom and the ability to enter into the one that they feel really works best for them. And they're doing that with their eyes wide open. So that could be the barrier is not economic, right? And maybe you're in a place where this is not even an avenue you've considered, but it's I have a way in and I don't have to worry about the money part. And I feel I know now the dangers versus just sort of stumbling across an Instagram ad. And I don't know. I mean, I had a particularly crazy experience with ketamine, and that's why it really opened my eyes to the power of that medicine and what people are really actually doing. It's not just getting an infusion. This is psychedelic soul work at the deepest level of your psyche, potentially. And so accepting that potentiality is a big responsibility. And I think we need to acknowledge that and acknowledge that this kind of therapy, as you know, is very much about beyond the chemical reactions. It's about that deep psychological, I'm just going to call it soul work. I mean, that kind of is the real power and juice of it. And so we can't, not working with that, acknowledging that, in some ways putting that at the top of the altar, it does a disservice and denying what you're really there to do, and maybe why you came into this space, whether you knew it or not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, let's speak a little bit to regulation, because you're bringing up an important point. I think in America, in the U.S., right, regulation.
Taxes.
We don't like to be regulated. But let's talk about this as an analogy that I like to use is driving, right? So let's pretend that psychedelics are vehicles. They help us get somewhere, right?
Where is that place? Where are we going?
That's different. It's different. It's different for everyone. We could pretend that all the psychedelics are maybe different kinds of cars, right? Buses and small cars, and so different psychedelic substances are all of these cars, and decriminalization or medicalization or access, increasing access is making cars more available for people to get somewhere, right? Making these vehicles more available for people to get somewhere. So I think the education piece is important. If you think about when you learned to drive, you got education on how to drive, right? You didn't just go and get in your car and just go out there, right? So that was really important. So education around the different substances, where they might take you, where you might want to go, right? Setting intentions of where do you want to go with this? Where do you not want to go, right? When you get in a car, it's generally good to know where you're going. And then education is also like a map. It's what is the territory? What is known about the territory based on so many people's past experiences? What can the experiences and the wisdom and knowledge of people who have been there before tell you, and, you have a map now.
I just use GPS. It's all good.
Or GPS, right? But,
yeah.
But what is GPS, right? It's like, there's probably an analogy for that. So, and then there's regulation, right? So we have, at least here in the US, and I mean, I've traveled to other countries that maybe don't have the same system of regulation of traffic as we do here. But in the US, if you just set people loose and you're like, okay, you're 16, you can drive a car, but you don't teach them anything about, the regulations of the road, the traffic signs, the stop signs, the, what to do with other cars, how to navigate all of these things, the speed limit, right? It would just be crazy. So to me, it's like, that's what regulation is it's helping provide some boundaries and some safety. And when you're in a culture that has been we've been suppressed on so many levels, but when it comes to psychedelics and the suppression of consciousness and the suppression of like freedom of thought and cognitive liberty and being able to like go where we want to go, I think that it's actually really dangerous to just set people loose on the road without any regulation. So I think that those regulations that can be established, and those are informed regulations that are informed by the psychedelic field and by people who've been in the community for many years. They're not just regulations that are just like top-down regulations from the government that's like, this is how you should use psilocybin. So I'm a big fan of regulation and education.
I hear that. And for the sake of discussion, let me push back and say this. Now, you could argue in that same analogy that driving is a privilege. It is not a right. We have to, that's what it says in the law. Whereas things like owning a gun is a right. To vote is your right. It can be taken away from you. It's based on your age. It would make sense to me that your cognitive liberty and ability to control your consciousness is your right. It is not a privilege that I need to be given by any authority to tell me how to do it. And so we're inside now a system that gets a little tricky from sort of an ethical level about, yes, I do agree. I actually think it would make a lot of sense to get a license for a gun. Shouldn't I need to know how to use it a little bit before I can go buy one? But in fact, in this country, you can walk into a store if you have some ID, you walk out with a gun. That's it. No one asks you anything about how to use it, what to do with it, where to store it, nothing. Because we've built that into our Constitution for whatever you think about that. And so you bring that into the psychedelic space, and it's like, what if I want to believe that is my right, especially if it's not hurting anybody. It's not even like a gun. To take a substance that's growing out of the ground, like a mushroom or a marijuana plant, and to smoke it. That's my decision on my own private time in my own home. But we're working through a system where we want to have regulations. And I know the intent. I agree with the intent to make it safer and information and education. But there is that balance, if you think about it that way, where it's like it's a slippery slope than to say, like, you can do it, you can't do it, this is how you do it, this is how you pay for it, and this is who you pay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think, you're kind of pointing to that accessibility piece, which is like not everyone can afford a car.
There you
right?
go.
So that's one set of issues that's being addressed. And then the other one is, that I hear you speaking to is this piece around it is taking a substance versus your behavior, right? So I think in general that laws around substances, all substance use, like let's get out of the psychedelic box for just 1 second. I know we're talking about psychedelics today, but behavior.
We don't have to, but
right? How is if your substance use, your psychedelic use, is having behavioral issues that are causing harm to people around you, or that are potentially causing harm to people around you, right? Shouldn't be driving when you're on a psychedelic. You shouldn't. There should be regulation around behavior as it relates to psychedelics.
Of course.
Absolutely, and that's and that exists obviously
for everything, like
yes.
all behavior in general. We have laws. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but I think that for drugs specifically, we've been because they've been stigmatized for so long and criminalized for so long. I think that we're moving out of that old paradigm where when we talk about drug use, and we talk about things like addiction in this society, it is very much like a drug use is bad, not like let's focus on behaviors that people are doing, and let's focus on making sure that people are, safe and that others around them are safe. I think that's where we need to put our focus.
Yeah, yeah, and I think there's been some success with that in other countries in certain ways, but yeah, it's the American mindset and model is so unique. I mean, whether you look at our coronavirus response or anything, guns, drugs, in a lot of ways, we're the leader on that. But we have an irony of our cognitive obstinance of liberty, yet we then don't follow through on that by just allowing that liberty. It's like, I don't know, it's a weird fear there, almost like an adolescent growth nodal point. We can't seem to like break through, where it's like, but that's the thing you say you want and that you stand on, but then those are the people who won't let it happen. And it's a growing pain. It's a big one. But boy, are we in a time of growth and change. And I know that you guys have been, and you're right in the middle of it and have been for a long time. So I do appreciate you diving into this space and filling us in, like where the leading edge is on everything, and being game to play along with some of my devil's advocate. I'm actually quite an optimist about it. But I think it makes a better conversation if we kind of try to explore the different viewpoints.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's really important because it's the conversation that's happening right now. The psychedelic community isn't one unified field of everyone kind of being on the same page. It's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of conflict. And, I think if psychedelics psychedelics can teach us many things, but one thing that they can teach us is how to work together, and that we are all connected to one reality, and or I don't say one reality, there's multiple realities, but we're all connected. And that, I really hope, it's my hope that some of those conflicts and disagreements that are happening within the field, that the field can work to navigate some of those conflicts, because I think that the psychedelic experience does inform us on how to navigate difficult interpersonal issues.
Yeah.
So thank you for bringing that, because it's important.
Yeah, and this is how we do it. And that's kind of been one of my main goals with this, is part of that education, so to speak, is having these conversations, voicing some of these ideas, giving people opportunities to voice their ideas and explore it. And it's an ongoing conversation and evolution. So thanks for being a part of it.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers. Thank you, Sarah. Really appreciate you coming on. And I love the timing with this new initiative in Oregon that had a resounding pass, a resounding success. So that is a wonderful sign. This song you're hearing in the background is called Passage, and it is from the album Spores, which is now available on digital and vinyl wherever you listen to music. And the vinyl is available at eastforest.org, along with all the other merch items. Listen, guys, interesting week ahead, and keep your head high. Just remember to get outside, keep breathing. Remember to get in touch with the things that are actually right around you, like your communities and your families and your friends and your loved ones and yourself and nature and all the beings that surround us, and this web of life and this incarnation that we are in. Keep walking your walk, friends. Don't take any shit, but if you do, do it with grace.